see it.
I can send it to you later. That's no problem.
Thank you.
No problem. And thank you so much, Siobhan. Over to you.
Thank you. I hope you can hear and see the right screen this time around. Yes, I am Siobhan. I am a publishing technology librarian at the Open Library of Humanities and Janeway Systems. Before that, I have worked in acquisitions at the University of Leeds. I've done a brief stint at Huddersfield University Press as a student assistant, and I have partially done a PhD before I dropped out for health reasons. So I've kind of been on multiple sides of the divide within the academy. Today, however, I'm going to be speaking specifically about human libraries and a critique thereof. The first thing I do want to say is that I know that people in this audience might have done, and probably will have done, human libraries at their institutions. And I just want to preface this is not a personal critique, this is a critique of the concept rather, and the institution. That being said, the things you watch us carry. For those who've not read the book, it is quite good. Let's see if I can progress this. So, what is a human library? There's both the explanation on the slide. And I've given this one here, despite the fact that it isn't a very good definition, because a human library is actually a trademark concept I found out. It is originally Danish, and it started as an initiative to overcome sort of hate and promote diversity and give people the opportunity to speak to other people they might not usually see and learn about their differences, say religious, ethnicity, lifestyle differences, social, etc. And I think in theory, I think it's a very good idea. I have some comments on the practice as the title might have given away. So yeah, I did want to provide you the actual definition given by the Human Library Organization themselves. It gives them a chance to provide their own input here. Personally, I think we're getting a little bit high on the Kool-Aid, but more on that later. Yeah, but so in essence, you would go to a human library to borrow a book, which is a person who has a different experience from yours, presumably, and you can ask them all kinds of questions about their life to learn from them as a resource. But I think before I start on what I think are potential issues with this approach, I would also like to first define the scope of the critique I'm giving, because I think that it is quite important to understand the context from which I am looking at this initiative. So I am looking specifically at the application of human libraries within UK HU academic libraries, which is very different from, say, community libraries, public libraries, community initiatives, which exist in a very different framework and a different social concept. Secondly, I'm looking specifically at human libraries as a tool for liberation of social justice through the application of EDI. Tina's talk before did a much better job than I could ever do at explaining the difference between social justice and EDI. So if you're interested in that, look at Tina's talk. And I am also more specifically looking at the human library as a tool for the inclusion of the other. The reason I'm taking this scope is because in my experience, this is what we have been using human libraries for within UKHE. Whether we have said as much or not, that is what they have been deployed to do, to use some militaristic language. But you might say, well, if we think about the concept of a human library, the concept of you speak to people and you learn about them, their religion and their culture, surely this is a good thing. And I think to cite Oscar Wilde, who has a delightful quote for this, which I came across because of Nancy's talk yesterday, I was reminded of it. He says, just as the worst slave owners were those who were kind to their slaves and so prevented the horror of the system being realized by those who suffered from it and understood by those who contemplated it. So in the present state of things in England, the people who do most harm are the people who try to do most good. I think this is a really powerful quote because it very much addresses this point of this looks like a very good initiative on the top, then what is the issue with it? And this might sound really extreme, and this is something that Anand Giridharadas, sorry, I got that wrong, also has an answer for, and he says, how can there be wrong with trying to do good? The answer may be when the good is an accomplice to an even greater, more invisible harm. And in my opinion, I think that is the issue with the way that human libraries are being used within UKE libraries. So what is my critique? And I've tried to split this into 4 categories to make it easy to follow along. I do have to say, not all of these will neatly slot into these categories. That is often quite difficult when we are engaging in critical theory and critical reflection, that things don't neatly fit into multiple, like singular absolute categories. But I have tried to make this distinction for ease of understanding, as I know I can be going on a bit of a whirlwind. So my first objection is around the harm that I think human libraries can do. And most of my concerns here, and these are the easiest ones to sort of grapple with, are around language and safeguarding. So my first issue with human libraries is that I think there is a real risk of objectification of the book, because we are quite literally referring to people as books who are being borrowed and lent. And I think it is quite clear that there is a real risk of objectification, because it takes away the human element of a person and turns them into a book, which I am also myself quite uncomfortable with as someone from a marginalized background. The second part is that it has a risk of turning this into a human zoo. And this is not a critique that I have singularly experienced. It is also one I have heard from others of marginalized backgrounds, especially those who have what you might call othered bodies, and I mean it in this quite a broad context. So for example, in queerness or in disability or even in racialization, if you have been physically othered through your body, there is a real feeling that being objectified and being put on, sort of being exhibited in that way, puts you in a human zoo. And I think that is a real risk in terms of harm that these things can do. And the other thing is around safeguarding measures, and simply who is actually doing the safeguarding, and are the people doing the safeguarding guarded themselves? How are their biases handled? Now the Human Library organization itself has an answer for safeguarding, where they say, "Our friendly librarians and your book depot manager are always there to help you and make sure that you are kept in mint condition. They are there to ensure that you have a good experience every time you are published." I don't think, being very honest, that this is good safeguarding practice, or that this communicates good safeguarding. Based on some research, I have seen that some organizations do employ mental health first aiders and have these reviewing sessions. I, however, would say that these are still not sufficient safeguarding. Also, because I would like to sort of offer the provocation of how much can a mental health professional, sort of a mental health first aider do when you have experienced, say, a hate crime, or if someone has said something to you that is very uncomfortable or potentially offensive. Moving on to sort of the second category of the critique, it is around much sense around benefit, which very easily said is what is gained from these initiatives and for whom. So when a human library is organized, what is the goal? What is the actual aim of this exercise? So are we doing this to just have a chat? Are we trying to do general learning? Because for that, I do think it works. However, are we trying to use the human library as a tool for social justice? And that, I think, is not really working well. And also, who's actually benefiting from the human library? And I think this is one of my main issues with it, is that those who benefit from the human library are the readers, who tend to typically be white, middle-class, cishet women, who already have quite a lot of power within the academy, and especially within the structure of the library. Those are quite, they are, I'm going to say, maybe not as well off as their male counterparts, but still in a much more privileged position than many others of us. And I think that is a real question that we need to be asking, not just about human library, but about many social justice or EDI initiatives, is who is this for? Who is benefiting? At the end of the day, who has gained? Or is this another form of extractive research, which I would argue this is? And which also touches on, is the human library actually the right tool for the job? Because it is, I think, at its heart, designed as a tool to encounter new things and to learn about people and cultures outside of your perception almost. And I think it is really powerful for that, to discuss and think about things that you might not have thought about before at all, or scenarios you might have not have encountered at all. However, when we look within the structure of the academy, we are aware of the issues already. We know what racism is. I think we have all hopefully met a non-white person. I think we know what disability is. Do we really need to visit a human library to learn about this? Or should we potentially do the job ourselves? And then I think, not to take a very neoliberal approach, but what are the actual results? And I don't mean this in the sense of what are the tangible numerical approaches? Is that KPI? None of that, but what is actually happening? Have we ever actually checked after the fact if anything has improved, particularly those of marginalized backgrounds, assuming that they were the ones meant to benefit from this? And I think that that is something that is really key to consider here. Then I think the other issue, the other sort of category of critique of human libraries for me is around power, and especially around whether we are empowering minorities or whether we are controlling them. And I say this because I think the academy and libraries within that, they have inherent hierarchies. It is impossible to exist within the body of the academy or within the library and not be subject to hierarchy. And I think especially within the UK, because I can't speak for other countries, we have a slight obsession with grades. We have very set structures at what grade and what job title is allowed to do what and in what way, and who has certain levels of knowledge and who is acceptable knowledge and all of that. And there is a lot of power, and you can't just step into a different room and into this human library and expect these hierarchies to not exist, to not have this concept of power act upon you and your social relationships. To say, I will be participating in this, and one of my manager's manager steps into the room, can I really speak freely? Or am I potentially now put in a very vulnerable position? And I think that is definitely something to consider. The other one is, again, around power of who is actually providing the labor. And I don't necessarily mean the administrative labor of like booking the room, but in a human library, who is doing the work? And I would argue it's the books, it's the people volunteering their time, offering their vulnerability and offering their stories, who are doing a lot of work and who are providing a lot of labor to solve a problem and a system that they have not created. It's a recurring theme, I think, within a lot of social justice work, is that we are being asked to solve problems that we didn't create. And I think human libraries fall victim to the same problem here. And similarly to that, who is being empowered? Who is given more social currency here? Who has gained something at the end of it? And I feel like this is often more so the case for the readers than the books, because you get to do a different kind of almost, and I feel quite bad saying it's social posturing of, oh, look at me, I have engaged in this very diversifying activity and I've learned so much. But the actual people who have volunteered their time have not been empowered in the same way. In similar things that we see in academic research, it has been extractive, so things have been taken from them, but very little has been given back to them. And ultimately, how does this actually affect the status quo, assuming that has been our aim to disrupt in the first place? Has anything actually happened? Is there any change? Or are we simply chugging along with the same ways, the same neoliberal ways of the academy? And I'd like to draw your attention to something that Naomi Smith actually said this morning around labor. For those who don't know Naomi, Naomi used to be a librarian. She's a was a black librarian, and she quit due to the amount of racism in the profession. Personally, I do miss her dearly. But I think she makes a really good point around labor and around the duty placed upon marginalized peoples to provide education and to, in this case, be education, with no expectation of the learner to actually do their homework. Because I do sometimes think to myself, why is it my job to speak and to explain and to be the information if you could just get your phone out and Google this? Why do I have to do work for you to feel good when you could have just sat behind your computer and left me alone today? And it also places a lot of responsibilities on us. I also want to draw attention to another quotation actually from the Human Library Organization website around what a book is, because I think this very much touches on the issue of power and my previous issue around objectification. I will give you a moment to read as I very subtly drink some water. And I would like to draw attention in particular to the last bit of this quote, which says, books are not political or on a mission one with us, but rather able to surrender to the agenda of the reader and allow them to control the conversation. Now, there's a lot to unpack there, a lot. But I think the thing that I'd like to draw attention to here when we think about empowering and power and just existence is the idea of a person not being political is, I think, comes from an inherent place of privilege. Say, if we look at the UK, if you are a trans person in the UK right now, your existence is political. You can't not be political. In the same way that if you are a brown migrant or a black migrant right now in the UK, your existence is political. If you open the news, your very existence is political right now. There is no way to not be political. And in many ways, I do sometimes feel like, as a white passing mixed race woman, that my existence is also political. The moment I share my heritage, politics comes into play. And I think the conception that the political and the personal and the professional can be separated as such is faulty. And I think comes from a place of privilege and power. Only those with sufficient power and privilege can pretend neutrality and apoliticality. And I'm sure that I'm preaching to the choir here when I talk about the library not being neutral, books not being neutral. And I think it touches on this. And I think it is a very clear display of power here. And I think also the concept of the controlling a conversation as a reader, lots to unpack. And I shan't do it now because I will be talking to you for a long time. Which does, however, very nicely, I think, lead to my last category of critique, which is around vulnerability and respectability. The first one is a quite easy point, which anyone who knows me, I am very much a trade unionist. Compensation. I think that this is labor, and labor ought to be compensated. Now, as I will show in a moment, the Human Library Organization disagrees with me. And whilst I know that certain organizers in the UK have in fact compensated their workers, which is good, I think this is still an issue. The other issue is around equality and social justice as skilled labor and their devaluation, the Greta Thunberg treatment, which I will also explain, critical self-reflection and policy and change. Because all of these are a little larger, I will be doing this slide by slide. So I'd like to firstly point out just this comment about compensation from the Human Library Organization, that this has to be entirely voluntary, and that books need to be motivated primarily by the chance to speak, yada, yada, yada. Now, I think that this reeks, first of all, of vocational art, and second of all, of power, because the concept that your words are somehow more powerful if they have not been appropriately reimbursed, or that you might be biased for a fair payment for your labor. I think there's a lot to unpack that politically, especially when we think about privilege and when we think about the value of information and who is extracting value from lived experience. And I find this generally quite icky, and I think that this is deeply problematic. Then social justice work as skilled labor. And I think this is very much about the idea that a marginalized person is a natural EDI practitioner, which is something we see quite often, is that when we are in our committees and in our organizations, that if there's EDI work to be done, we go, hold on, I know a guy, and that guy or girl or non-binary person is very often a person of color or someone who's disabled, and we're like, we got it covered. And you know what, this person might actually rather be getting on with their day. That is actually, if we think about it, no real reason that a marginalized person would be a natural EDI practitioner. Because the very concept of that devalues the formal or even informal knowledge, experience, and education that is required to be a practitioner. Because whilst lived experience is really key to doing a lot of this work, and this work should be informed by it, the doing of the work, the labor, is much more than having the experience. It's about social policy, legal frameworks, compliance, organizational psychology, about knowing how to even just do project management and admin. All of this is skilled work that is also quite often made invisible when talking about EDI, that is now being put on just a marginalized person that you've probably found in the hallway somewhere. And again, I think that is a degree of this being problematic, and this does specifically apply to the HE library context, because the original human library doesn't have the same institutional concept and framework within which this takes place, where the work is about the learning, whereas here we are trying to achieve a specific goal. Greta Thunberg treatment. This is the best way I could explain this. It is effectively talking about palpable minorities. So Greta Thunberg, when she was younger and mostly talking about climate change, was kind of, we saw her in the media a lot. She was celebrated and she was allowed in these spaces. Now that she has moved on to criticizing capitalism or say Israel, and has become much more vocal in her support for Palestine, we see that she isn't allowed in these spaces anymore. And I think this mirrors a dynamic we do sometimes see in the academy, where we invite the palpable minorities into the room to speak and to sort of be put on this pedestal, but we won't actually listen to people who are difficult, or as we say, difficult. And it also almost puts in this deficit model of social justice is underlying it, where being marginalized is presented as a deficit and something we have to fix, and we have to be more palpable, and we have to fit ourselves into this space, and we have to make ourselves respectable. When actually we need to ask, is it us that have to change? Do we have to be respectable? Or do you have to become more comfortable with discomfort and with difference? And I think similarly, it's a comment I made earlier. Is it about difficult questions or about difficult answers? And I think the most important thing perhaps is that we have to think about learning and critical self-reflection. I've just realized the time. I will have to rush a little bit. My apologies. I think the human library at its core keeps us comfortable. It focuses, it talks about asking difficult questions, when in reality, it will struggle to actually deal with difficult answers and unwilling to hear them. And it avoids discomfort as a learning tool. It avoids actually engaging with something. It very much allows us to sit there and pat ourselves on the back for having done something inclusive, for having listened to all these poor marginalized people. We've given them a voice. But we've not done anything else. We have refused to actually step out of the comfortable confines of power and hierarchy. And we have, I didn't want to say it, but I've now lost a nice word I was going to use, so I will say it. I think it is a form of library slacktivism. I think it is doing activism. Well, it is making yourself comfortable under the guise of activism. And I think it lacks actually critical self-reflection as practices, which I think is key in this area. And I think it doesn't engage with shame and discomfort, which I think are really powerful drivers when it comes to learning, because we work in universities where learning is key, yet we are so resistant to it, and we are resistant to the discomfort of learning, and we are resistant to the shame of getting it wrong, when, if anything, that is the absolute best way to learn, I think. And I think as on a whole, it is reminiscent of thoughts and prayers. It is a bit like saying, oh, yes, 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 we have done the good thing, we have done the presentable, nice thing, but we won't actually take action. And for those who don't know, this is a thoughts and prayers game. If you at any point press the button for gun control, you die. So I recommend looking it up. It is an interesting form of doing games as a critique. And I couldn't resist a brief quote from Pope Francis, given our current times, because I feel like when even the Pope is telling you that thoughts and prayers isn't cutting it, I think that is a sign to move to action, as he is the authority. So what do we need? We need policy and change. And I will do this briefly. The first thing to realize is anecdotes aren't data. You can't use them interchangeably, nor do we need more data. We have enough data. We can do the work. Instead, we need to give people a seat at the table, to give them decision-making powers, to actually have pathways to embedded structural long-term change, and to give us the ability to contribute, to have accountability structures, both in terms of change making, in terms of the interpersonal, and in terms of the actual social justice work that is being done, because I don't believe that you can strive for social justice without embedding accountability. And I think on an individual level, most importantly, to engage in continuous learning, because this is a continuous path. So in conclusion, and I will not have time for another slide, but that's okay. I think that this approach to learning diversity and sort of social diffusion as a means of achieving justice furthers the idea that inequalities are accidental and unwitting. And I think, as Les Beck has put it, the unwitting notion of racism, the unwitting notion of racism somehow abrogates responsibility like a racist playground spat, like I didn't mean anything by it. And I think that by using this approach, we are further confirming that that is our view. And I think we can even take this one step further if we look at Sarah Emmett's concept of disidentification, where we talk about human libraries having a risk of facilitating disidentification and the repositioning of the self, because by talking about systemic racism and putting it away from us, but then also doing this sort of this easier work where we go, oh, but I am the progressive nice person. You move yourself away from the problem, you remove yourself. And I think the refusal makes that even more powerful. And I see this also combines with vocational R, where we have a professional and personal investment in being left-wing tolerant and liberal. And I think that is also, and I'm going to skip this bit, but I think ultimately we need to consider whether human libraries and some of our other projects more generally, whether they are tools that have been co-opted or adjusted by the neo-colonial enterprise of the academy or the university, and whether they are not just reproducing extractive imperialistic structures, and whether they are, which I think human libraries do, converting experience and knowledges to currency for social and epistemic dominance, which is then given to the existing elites, which in this case are those already in positions of social privilege. I was going to do a very cool on the flip side with my nice animation here. I do think there are uses for human libraries. I won't go in for them right now. More importantly, I'd like to say, if you're going to do work, do events for and by marginalized staff. Actually give us an opportunity to speak, give us an opportunity to organize our own events and listen to us in what it is we'd like to do. Similarly, I'd recommend to engage in self-reflection and training, because I do think that allyship, that critical self-reflection is the best way of doing allyship, and that continuous learning is important, as we often place the emphasis on marginalized people and how we have to improve and using a deficit model. But I'd like to flip that on its head and say, maybe the problem isn't with us, maybe it's with you in some ways. And I think to learn to love the process, because ultimately, whilst this is challenging and hard and uncomfortable, and I think there's you're going to feel a lot of shame, there's joy in it as well. There's joy in learning and changing and looking back and realizing how far you've come, even if that includes looking at mistakes, because I don't feel that if you never make a mistake, you can never improve, which to me is one of the saddest things that could happen. And thank you for that. I think I am bang on time.
You
and
are.
my apologies for rushing through.
No problem. Thank you so much, Siobhan. That was super interesting. Lots of people having chats about what you are saying. So thank you so much. I'm just